right, let's get started. Hi there. It's the last lecture. Here's what we're going to do today. We're going to do the last lecture, and then we're going to have course evaluations at the end. So there'll be two evaluations for me and evaluation for the TA, the hard-working, outstanding TA, Lisa, and then that'll be it. And then Friday, we will have the final, right here in the middle of week 10, or at least the end of week 10, and then finals week. Just go, do your thing, have a good time, and enjoy your summer. So, last lecture. We've covered a lot of ground. 10 weeks, not that much time. Still, it seems like we've covered a lot of topics. But we haven't covered everything. I mean, we haven't covered every question we could possibly ask. So, I want to do something a little bit experimental. Do you have any questions about things we didn't cover? So let me explain where this comes from. Sometimes Tom Bradbury and I give seminars for couples where we try to, share some of this wisdom with actual couples. And at the end of the seminar we say, do you have any questions that we haven't talked about? Any questions about things, not advice, not personal advice for you, but questions about relationships? And we've written a whole book. We didn't talk about everything in the book. So I want to know, is there something that you're wondering about? Because this is it. This is the last lecture. There ain't no more. So this would be your last chance to say, since I'm in a class on intimate relationships, there is this thing that I've always been wondering about that we never talked about, didn't see it in the book. Maybe I know about it. Maybe I don't. In which case there'll be an awkward silence and everyone will laugh. But this is an opportunity to stump me, an opportunity to get questions answered. Now I have a prepared lecture, and I'm going to give it. But before I do, I just want to give you one last chance. There's nothing else on the slide. It's asking you, do you have any questions for me about intimate relationships before we finish off this class? Yes, David.
How do antidepressants affect selecting a partner?
Wow. I have no idea. The question, let me just phrase the question, is how does presumably taking antidepressants affect selecting a partner? And I don't know. It's a great question. I will answer it obliquely, only by saying that I have a colleague who's doing research on a related question. And her question is, how does taking the pill affect selecting a partner? Here's how she's thinking about this. She says, it turns out, we didn't talk about this a lot in this class, but there's good research that shows that women's mate preferences change over the menstrual cycle. There's actually a lot of evidence for this. That women desire different things in a mate when they are ovulating than when they are not ovulating. Now, most women would probably deny this, but there's a lot of good experimental evidence that takes women, college students like yourself, into the laboratory, measures exactly where they are in the ovulatory cycle, and then asks them, what would you like in a mate? How much are these qualities important to you? From these pictures, who would you like more? And what they find is that the same women, or when women are sort of quasi-randomly assigned, in other words, they're selected not on the basis of where they are in the menstrual cycle, and we just sort of measure where they are. Women who happen to be ovulating are more attracted to men who are large, men who are more masculine in the face, have more of a square jaw, and sort of a little bit more aggressive, than women who are in a different phase of their ovulatory cycle. This is Dr. Marty Hazelton who's doing this work here at UCLA. So her theory is that during ovulation, women are acutely sensitive to issues of genetic fitness. What follows there is that if you're attracted to a man while you're ovulating, that man may well be genetically more fit than other men. You might be sensitive to things that you're not even consciously aware of, like how that person smells. And there's some research showing that the smells that women find attractive when they're ovulating are the smells of men who would make actually a good genetic fit. It follows from that any chemical that you might be taking on a regular basis to prevent pregnancy that interferes with ovulation will also interfere with the ability to sense genetic fitness in a partner. It follows, too, that should you then marry that partner that you selected while on the pill, and then you decide, now we're married, hey, let's go off the pill and try to get pregnant, suddenly you'll be sensitive to issues that you were not sensitive to while on the pill. And should, newly sensitive, you realize, hey, this person is not attractive to me anymore, that would be a threat to the relationship. In fact, she has shown that in the United States, this is just correlational data, but she has new analysis showing that as the use of the pill went up, divorce rates also went up. Kind of neat. The implication of all this, which is all, I'm just cutting edge stuff, is that the chemicals that we take during the mate selection phase may well affect the quality of the mate selections that we do. That's not a direct answer to David's question about the effect of antidepressants, which I know nothing about, but it did give me an excuse to talk about something that I do know something about. Any other questions about things we didn't talk about in class that are related to intimate relationships? This is your chance and your final one. Micah.
I know that we've addressed the fact that most couples seek tertiary prevention once their relationship is already in trouble. Is it a good idea for a couple who aren't having problems to see like a moderator or a therapist to discuss small issues?
Micah's question is, we know from a couple lectures back that most couples don't seek outside intervention until they have serious problems that are entrenched and difficult to solve. So Micah's question is a value judgment that he's asking me to make, which is it a good idea for couples while they're still happy to seek out maybe a moderator or an outside observer of the relationship? And my answer to that question, which is a fair one, is to not go that far and say, oh, I think that all couples, even happy couples, should necessarily pay to see a therapist. What I would say is that happy couples should make efforts to invest in the relationship in ways that will help them stay happy. There are many ways to do this, though. We talked in class about how primary prevention for couples, in other words, programs that are given to couples to help prevent the development of problems, those programs take many forms. Books, videos, weekend retreats for couples. Not all of them are kind of the therapy model for happy couples. I would say that it probably is, at the very least, fun for happy couples to do stuff like that. To think actively about the relationship. That does seem like a good thing. I cannot say, with evidence behind me, that couples who do that do better, because there's a huge selection effect. Turns out the couples that are A, happiest, and B, the most into their relationships are the ones that are more likely to enroll in those kind of programs. Well, they do better, but it's not clear that the programs have an incremental effect over the qualities that brought them to the programs in the first place. But, and here's the bottom line, it couldn't hoit. Any other questions about intimacy? There's a question in the back. Is that Megan? Megan. Megan asked a question about attachment theory. And Megan says, can being with a really good partner change your attachment style? Presumably, Megan asks, if you have an insecure attachment style based on parental experience or experiences in other bad relationships, can finding lucky you, the right partner, and being with that partner for a long time and having experiences of that partner being there for you when you need that person, can that actually change an insecure attachment style into a secure attachment style? Did I get your question right, Megan? The answer to that question is actually, I think, a pretty well-documented yes, it can. I've participated in some of that research where we show that attachment styles and attachment models, particularly in a given relationship, can change over time. In a relationship that is satisfying over the long term, people who start out as insecure can become secure with their relationships. You might imagine, what would be the process? I think the answer is the process would be the experience of needing someone and that person being there. That would be a powerful experience of being vulnerable and having someone protect you. That we talked about sort of these relationship tests Well, those would be the moments when relationships are tested. Relationships that pass that test do have the power to change enduring attachment styles. And there's good evidence for that. Other questions? I've never done this before, and it's really fun, at least for me. What's your name? Laura. Laura follows up on that question and says, well, if that relationship should end, would the effects of any attachment style changes last and persist to another relationship? I think it would have to depend on how the relationship ended. I have no specific evidence for that. But I would think that if a relationship that you had grown to trust then betrayed you, well, then you might end up worse off than before, you could imagine. But if it ended in some other way, maybe cordially, you might take away from that good relationship still a positive feeling that people can be trusted, that might well persist to other relationships. That's speculation on my part. Other questions about intimacy? Jessica?
Is there studies that will kind of give us different qualities? Okay, let's say newlywed versus people who've been married 50 years. Do they describe their love differently, or do people who have been married 50 years, are they still in love?
That's a fantastic question. And there's a couple different, people have tried to do studies of that. And it's something we absolutely didn't talk a lot about in this class. So I'm glad you brought it up. The question is, to rephrase Jessica's question, do we know anything about the way the quality of love between intimate partners changes over the life course? Is when newlyweds say, oh, I'm in love, is there something different about that love than there is about couples who've been together for 50 years who say, oh, I'm in love with the same partner 50 years later? Are those the same love or different love? Well, there's some controversy on this point. Some people believe, and some people have written, that there are, and you've probably heard this before, different qualities of love from passionate to companionate. Perhaps you've heard of this distinction again. It's not a distinction that we made too much of in our textbook. But the idea being that when couples first get together, they're experiencing passionate love. A very emotionally aroused, very erotically charged, very emotionally intense desire to be with each other all the time. Passionate love. And some people have written that over time, passionate love tends to fade. And if you're lucky, it's replaced by what they call companionate love. A feeling that the other person can be depended upon, a feeling of enjoying the other person, of relying on the other person, a comfort with the other person. The difference between passionate love and companionate love can be expressed this way. Passionate love means when I'm around the person, my physiological arousal goes up. Oh my gosh, there they are. Companionate love means when I'm around the other person, my physiological arousal goes down. Ah, there they are. You see the difference? And for many years, that was the model, is that you start out with the passionate arousal of love, and then to the relaxed comfort of love, both of which are quite rewarding in their way. Recently, though, I'm aware of data that calls that progression into question. There's a couple of kinds of data that calls that progression into question. One is that scores on passionate love and companionate love scales tend to be highly correlated with each other. In other words, people who say, oh, I feel so much passionate love for my partner, also say, I feel a lot of companionate love for my partner. So they don't actually, it's not that you have one and then it's replaced by the other. People tend to have both. And it's possible to say, oh, that person really arouses me, and I also feel comforted and nurtured by them. They're not mutually exclusive at all. More interesting is research by a fellow named Art Aaron, who comes up a lot in our textbooks because we love him. He's just a smart, great guy, and he's also funny. And the point about Art is that he has done some work with brain scans. And what he does is he takes newlywed couples, not just newlywed couples, but newlywed couples who report high levels of passionate love. And he puts them in the scanner. And he says, think about your partner. Thinking about my partner. And it looks at what parts of the brain light up. And then he takes people who've been married for years and years and years, who also report love for their partner. And he puts them in the scanner, and he says, thinks about your partner, and they say, I'm thinking about my partner. And guess what? The exact same parts of their brains light up. And now, that's the end of the data, but he interprets that to mean that at least it's conceivable and possible that couples who've been together for 50 years or more are feeling the exact same emotions that passionate newlyweds are feeling. Leo. I don't remember. I mean, so Leo says, wait a minute, he's questioning the details of the study, and I don't remember the details of the study. Other question? Is it Cassie? Okay, so Cassie says, what does science have to say about relationships that have an on and off pattern? First of all, let me see if I understand what you mean by an on and off pattern. You mean a relationship where you break up, but then you get back together, and you break up, and you get back together? My friend Kent had a relationship like that. I shouldn't say his name. But yeah, we know people like that. So you know a couple like that where they keep breaking up, but they still end up together, and they get together, and they think this time it'll work, and they break up. Science has two things. I know two kinds of data that bear on that kind of phenomenon. Here's one. One is the thinking of a fellow named Kurt Lewin, the godfather of social psychology. And Kurt Lewin had this to say about the force of negative and the force of positive things. What he said is this. An object has elements that attract us and elements that repel us. You can imagine a relationship might have elements that attract us and elements that repel us. And he says, and those forces get weaker as we get more distant from the target, from the source. But, he said, the force of negative weakens more quickly than the force of positive. What does that mean? Let me translate that into English. If you've got a person that gets inside your skin and drives you a little bit nuts, there's things you love about that person and things you can't stand about that person. The closer you get to a person, the more strongly the negative stuff affects you. But as you get farther away, then the power of the negative weakens, but the power of the positive stays stronger at a greater distance. So when you're close up, you're like, oh, you irritate me, I must leave you. And when you're over here, you're like, oh, but you do have that cute thing that you do. It's harder to remember the negatives when you're far away, at least in that perspective. So that kind of, to the extent that he's right about the effect of distance on positive and negative forces, that would partly explain some people who are trapped in this approach avoidance kind of relationship. But there's another line of data that bears on that phenomenon, and it's from attachment theory. And it says there are certain attachment styles that are more likely to find themselves in that kind of relationship. And what attachment style do you think it might be? Not secure. But insecure. In fact, specifically the sort of anxious, ambivalent, now known as preoccupied attachment style. The idea being that being with you is intolerable. It's too irritating, we don't get along, but I can't let you go. I can't actually just let you go because I'm preoccupied with you. There's some part of me that needs to win you over somehow. That approach avoidance conflict is more likely to happen in people with insecure attachment styles. People who are secure, they'll think, I can be loved, and the world is lovable, will go out and find someone that they can get along with better, and they know they're comfortable that they'll do it. On and off relationships tend to happen between people who have some doubts about one or the other side of that equation. Either, maybe I'll never find someone that I get along with as good as I get along, as well as I get along with you, even though we don't get along that well. So attachment style has been linked to that phenomenon as well. Daniel. Any studies done about being friends first? That's a great question. So Daniel's like, what about, does it affect how a relationship develops if you were friends first? Well, you'd think it would. I'll tell you the short answer is I'm not aware of great research on that topic. It may be there. I'll tell you also that in my own data on newlywed couples, every single study I've done, and I've done, I don't know, plenty, I always ask, were you friends first? And I've never analyzed it. So it's waiting. The data are there, right here in my back pocket, but I don't know the answer yet. Now I'm going to go back. I have to go. Daniel, you've lit a fire. What else you got? What else you got? Micah.
I have two questions, one of which relates to the class and one which doesn't really. So can I ask both?
Ask one and we'll see what happens.
In the class, I read in the text, I think we discussed in class too, how as people age, as like in the older population, the term that was used to describe these people's emotional capacities is that they were emotional experts. And I really like that term. And my question is, what can a young person do to become an emotional expert more rapidly?
Well, what can you do to become an emotional expert? What can you do to be good at relationships? Well, I don't want to be flip, but I think that this class contained a lot of wisdom along that score. That paying attention to the issues we've talked about, the sort of behavioral, cognitive, emotional, individual, and contextual issues, that's probably a good step. In fact, to be even more flip, I would say taking this class is probably a step in the right direction. At least I'd hope that it would be. But I mean, there were too many detailed things that I think are part of emotional expertise. But another part of emotional expertise is simply recognizing that not everything is in your control. Even if you know everything, memorize it, and even if you've written the book yourself, doesn't mean you're going to be perfect every minute. Let me get someone else's. Anyone? Was there a question? Melissa?
Yeah, I just have a comment on that.
A comment?
Yeah, on what he just said is that I'm in a relationship. I live with my boyfriend, and
Actual relationship experience speaking here.
and I've been trying to apply these things to my relationship, and it's been really working. So
I would call that a testimonial. So Melissa says that she's actually been trying to apply techniques and thoughts from this class to her relationship, and she discloses that it seems to be working, and obviously I couldn't imagine a more flattering and pleasant thing to hear. Thank you for sharing that, Melissa. You know what, let's keep going. What's your name? What's your name?
Elise.
Elise.
Is there a difference in relationship satisfaction between couples that have kids close in age versus far apart in age?
That's a good question. Elise asks, does it affect the parents' relationship, does the distance between their children in age affect the parents' relationship satisfaction? I don't know. I really don't. It's an interesting question. It seems easy to measure, but I am not aware of data on that topic. But I can speculate a little bit, and I would say that parents who have had a kid, wait a long time, and are still willing to have another kid must be pretty happy. I wouldn't know if that was a causal effect, but it would seem that having a big distance in age would be perhaps for some couples associated with a quality relationship, because it means that you're still willing to make that commitment and investment. But I only say that because there's a 7.5-year difference in my kid's age. Question, Maya. What is my opinion on online matchmaking sites? Well, that's a fair question. And since this is being recorded, then I will delicately say, let's think about it. So what does an online matchmaking site promise? It promises a number of things. Online matchmaking sites promise you access, and some of them promise you more than access. So the first thing an online matchmaking site promises you is access. In other words, it says, look, you're not going to meet that many people in your daily life. You can't. You're just one person, you move around, you'll meet only who you meet. Come to our site, and you can actually search for other human beings the way you could search Google or the way you could search Amazon for a book. So you can't argue with that. You absolutely cannot argue that online matchmaking, online sort of dating sites allow you to have contact with people and select people on variables that you couldn't do in real life under any circumstances. So that is a definite service that they're offering, and there's no disputing it. But I think you're asking about something more. I think you're saying some sites promise more than that. They say, we're not just going to give you access, we're going to actually set you up with people that are scientifically chosen. I'm revealing a little bit of my own bias here. Scientifically chosen to be good matches for you. Well, that presumes, of course, that science knows who's a good match for you. Now, Tom gave you the attraction lecture, and I did not. But what we know about attraction is that it's a mighty complicated thing. Now there's an assumption that online matchmaking sites make, which is this. The success of a match is primarily a function of how qualities of you match with the qualities of a potential partner. That is the assumption, because that's all they can work with. All they can do is ask you questions, measure your qualities, and match you up somehow with somebody else's qualities. That's all they can do. They don't know how you interact. They don't know anything about your tastes or your personal history except what they ask you. And all they can do is match your profile to somebody else's profile using some algorithm. That's all they can do. Well, research shows that matching between people's qualities gets you pretty far in terms of predicting whether they'll actually end up in a good relationship, but it doesn't get you that far. Which is to say that what makes for chemistry, what makes one individual actually feel romantic chemistry with another individual is not very strongly predicted by individual qualities of the two individuals, by specific qualities or matching on the qualities. It helps. It's best to be similar. But once you get into a room full of people who are all similar and above threshold on, reasonably attractive, reasonably socially skilled, what actually makes for the chemistry that makes you want to date this person, not that person, doesn't seem to have anything to do with qualities of the people. If that's true, then online matchmaking sites, which can only rely on individual qualities, will get you this far, but there's going to be this, wide canyon between preventing them from predicting really well who you're going to match up with. That said, our babysitter went on eHarmony looking for a husband and found one 6 weeks later, and they're getting married this summer. That wasn't an opinion, but that was sort of a description of how research on attraction and mate formation maps on to what online matchmaking sites can do and what they can't. Question. What's your name? Whitney. I can handle it. Well, Whitney's question is, informed no doubt by having recently seen the new Star Trek film, how much should we evaluate our relationships using logic, and how much should we evaluate our relationships using emotion? Given how important they are, relationships are indeed emotional, and yet they're important, so maybe we should use logic. I will answer in a way that may disappoint you, but I have to reject the emotion versus logic dichotomy. I must. I don't believe that it's either or even close to either or. Rather, we have emotional reactions to the things we experience. We can be emotional and logical at the same time. They're wrapped up in ways that they're inseparable. How should you evaluate your relationship? What's the best way? Well, you should, I suppose I might say, if you force me to use your language, you should logically assess what's going on in your relationship and then emotionally react to it. And if your emotions say, I really want this to work out, then you should logically figure out a way to make the most of what you've got. The problem with terms like logic or emotion is that logical tends to be praised and emotional tends to be disparaging. Oh, you're just being emotional, as if that's somehow illogical. Not at all. You can be logically emotional. Your emotional reactions can be quite logical and rational and reasonable. So I think it's a mistake to try to separate or choose one or the other, but rather to say you want to know how you're reacting emotionally in the moment to what you are really experiencing in the relationship. Someone who hasn't, Marianne, you haven't asked one today.
Okay, so thanks to the class brainwashing me. I'm just kidding. I learned a lot from the class, but now I'm trying between whether opposites attract or not. Now, according to the class, it says, the more
the question Marianne asks is, do opposites attract or not? Come on, bottom line, what's the story? And the bottom line is quite clear in the text and in the research, which is that opposites do not attract. I mean, the research on this could not be more clear, that when you compare people who are similar to each other, in their values at least, in their attitudes, in their interests, they get along better than people who are dissimilar. Democrats do better when they date Democrats. Republicans do better when they date Republicans. People of one religion, their relationships are easier and more successful if they date people who are of the same religion. It's harder to be different and it's easier to be similar. And there's lots of reasons why this would be true. But let's push it. Are there ever any circumstances where opposites attract? Well, what about personality traits, like depression? If you're depressed, do you want other depressed people? Is that what you're attracted to? If you're neurotic, are you attracted to other neurotic people? Where's the other neurotic people? Even that, very weak evidence. Relationships do better the less total depression there is in the relationship. If you're depressed, try to get someone who's not depressed to love you. So, again and again, we get down to similarity being more powerful than dissimilarity. There's just not a lot of... Then they're like, well, the guy who created what's known as the complementarity hypothesis, a sociologist named Winch, back in the day, Winch said, no, what about dominant people? They like submissives. Dominant people want to be with submissives. Outgoing people need shy people. So opposites attract on those personality dimensions. But you know, even that has not been supported in the literature at all. Not even close. In fact, what they find is this, quite a bit different thing. Similar people are attracted to each other. And then what sometimes happens is, when they are together, they adopt complementary roles. That's quite a different thing. Think about what that's saying. It's saying that I'm outgoing, my partner's outgoing, we're both outgoing. But when we're together, I might let this partner be the outgoing one, and I might take a back seat in the moment. That doesn't mean that I'm not also outgoing relative to my peers. I'm still pretty outgoing, just keep up with you. Similarity still rules the day. There's just not a lot of evidence for opposites attracting. That's just the truth. What's your name, Laura? What are the effects of partner age differences on relationship outcomes? There is literature on this because it's an easy thing to study, especially with respect to divorce. I mean, the census has exactly age data and exactly divorce data, so it's really easy to study. A lot of that work's been done in sociology. I'm not expert in it, but here's my best recollection of that data. Age differences, it's basically much less threatening to the relationship if the man is older, for evolutionarily psychological reasons that are not hard to discern. So the idea being that divorce rates are not as affected by men being older, but they increase when women are older than men. That's the best I can do. Now the question is do you want to be close in age? Is it really threatening to be wide in age? I don't know. And the reason I really want to say I don't know is because I'm sure there's good data on it, and since I don't know it, I don't want to misspeak. It's a good question. Stump number 2. How to look that up. What else you got? Sarah. Boy, Sarah, that's a really good, important question. We know the research shows that distance does not make the heart grow fonder. And it follows from everything we've talked about in this course. If intimacy is a fire that requires fuel, well then long distance is going to prevent fueling the fire of intimacy. If you're not in each other's presence, you're not going to be sharing as many new experiences or any experiences at all. It's going to be harder to nurture each other, support each other, and feed intimacy. So what can you do if you know that someone that you care about is in fact going to be distant from you? You know you're going to face that challenge. Number 1, from the course, recognize it's going to be a challenge. Number one is keep in mind, wow, we have a challenge. This is going to be a serious stressor for us. There's no way it's going to be a cakewalk. Number two, find every possible way to feed the intimacy when you're together and when you're apart. Nowadays, this is something interesting that the Army is actually studying right now. What are the effects of modern communication technology on the family outcomes of military service people? This is something that I personally am involved in studying. Because what's happening now in the military is that deployed service members have more contact with their families than in any other military conflict in the history of the world. Every other time there's been a war ever in the history of humanity, the people that's on the front had very serious troubles communicating with the people back home. Now, I can call you on my cell phone and say, hey, there's bullets flying right over me, and how are the kids? How does that affect relationships? How does that affect relationships? And there are two competing hypotheses. One is, because there's still so many constraints on what you can do for each other, it raises more opportunities for conflict. Maybe it's actually harder on families. The other hypothesis is, no, contact is good, connection is good, it's easier on families. It's an empirical question which we haven't answered. In terms of advice, though, if your partner in terms of advice, I would say, until the data come in, I would still say more contact is better. Make an effort. If it's not easy to devote time to your relationship, you just have to make that much more effort to devote time when you can. I do have a prepared lecture. Let's take a couple more, only because I'm enjoying it so much. I selfishly would like to take a couple more questions, and then I will give you the lecture that I prepared. Wyatt!
Okay, so I have a question about any research that's been done or any suggestions that you might have about couples whose families do not get along. The couple gets along, and each member of the couple gets along with the other person's family, but the families do not get along, like you're afraid to invite them to your wedding.
Yes. I hear you. The question Wyatt asks is there any research on the effects of in-laws not getting along with each other on the outcomes of the relationship? And there's research that touches on this, and it's actually described in chapter 13 a little bit. Basically, there's an effect, and it's not hard to intuit. That's bad. Basically, the more discord there is within the social network of the couple, the harder it is on the couple. That's just more opportunities for stress. You can imagine that if you had a choice, you'd rather that your in-laws get along with each other than not. That said, in this kind of situation, now I'm leaving the research aside for a moment, you can imagine that there are two different ways that the couple itself could react to this discord that will be very, very impactful on the relationship outcomes. One possibility is that the couple allows the discord in the in-laws to become a source of discord in the couple. In other words, how are you going to manage your mom to make sure she doesn't make a scene at Christmas this year? Versus, how are we going to manage your mom and the fact that she doesn't get along with my dad? What happens in these kind of situations where the in-laws don't get along is there's a tension within each individual in loyalty. Who's your priority? Your partner or your family? Because this is a situation where those things are now in conflict. There will be cultural differences in how people respond to this. And big ones that I think are imperfectly understood. In Western culture, where there is, and only in Western culture, where there's a clear value to sort of establishing your own family, relationships seem to do better when people clearly say to their partner, my priority is you. But that may not be true in other cultures. In fact, I think it may not be true in other cultures. So the short answer to your question is, conflict is not a good idea. Then the question is, how do you handle it? Try to be a team with your partner dealing with your families, rather than let the family conflict become an issue between the couple. That's my response to that. Anything else that we didn't cover? Lucas.
Yeah. With our studies that show that poverty being such an impactor on relationships and with high divorce rates, are there studies that look at the resiliency of couples and how they adapt, and how is it that in really low-income areas they have a good happy family? What is it that they're doing different?
Lucas is asking a good question. He says, if we know that poverty is bad for relationships, and it's super bad, But not all relationships in impoverished populations do poorly. Is there any research anywhere in the country going on that's looking at the resilience of low-income marriages? That's looking at low-income marriages and saying, what are the sources of success in that population? Because surely that would be important research. I'm doing that research. It's just getting started, though. I'll let you know how it goes. But I currently have 2 grants from the federal government, National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, to study exactly that question. Lucas! How'd you know? It's like a connection. Camille Claire.
We talked about how marital counseling is okay. Premarital counseling is better. We didn't talk about individual counseling.
Ah.
Are there any studies on that in high-risk relationships?
Camille Claire asks, we talked about, she says, look, couples counseling has certain effects. Premarital counseling has certain effects. What about individual counseling? What are the effects of individual counseling on relationship outcomes? It's a fantastic question. It's been studied extensively with respect to depression. So the issue is, depression and marital distress go hand in hand together. They're very closely related, especially for wives. For wives who are depressed, they're unhappy with their marriages. And wives in unhappy marriages are at high risk for depression. The question is, if you've got a person who's depressed and in an unhappy marriage, what's the best thing to do? Do you give them individual counseling and hope the marriage improves? Or do you give them marital counseling and hope the depression improves? I know there is an answer to this question, and I hope I get it right. And Tom, as a clinical psychologist, would know it off the top of his head. But as a social psychologist, I'm going to try to remember this. The answer differs for husbands and for wives. For wives, let me get this right, couples counseling improves their depression. But individual therapy without couples counseling isn't so effective because part of the depression is so a function of the marriage. For husbands, it's reversed. Husbands who get individual counseling for their depression, their marriages improve. But without individual counseling for their depression, couples counseling doesn't do such a great job. So if you want to improve the mental well-being of a husband and a wife, for a husband, research shows go in the individual route and the marriage will improve. For wives, go in the marital route and the depression improves. Well, that was fun. I'd like to, I don't know, I'll just give the rest of my lecture since I wrote it. And it's pretty good. But if you have other questions, I'm still a faculty here and I'm not going anywhere. So feel free to stop by and let's talk, because these are issues that don't go away and that I find endlessly fascinating. But you've asked me a lot of questions, and it's very interesting to me to hear what's, at the end of 10 weeks, still on your mind. Well, maybe it will be interesting to you to know that 10 weeks later, there's a question that's still on my mind, and it's the same damn question that we started the course with. The question, for me, is this. If everyone agrees that intimate relationships are to be desired, everyone wants them, that's why you're here, that's why we live, birds do it, bees do it, little birdies in the trees do it. Then why do they often fail? Nobody wants them to fail. No, Albert Einstein didn't want his relationships to fail, but they constantly failed. He sucked at relationships. Smart guy. And he cared. It's not that he didn't care. Why do relationships fail? Even though we don't want them to be. Every lecture, every week, we've addressed what I think is a piece of the puzzle. We've held each piece up to the light. We've looked at its shape. But we haven't yet put the pieces together. And that's what I'd like to do today before we end. It seems like we've raised a question. Now let's try to answer it. And I think that the answer starts with saying that there are some, on one hand, there's hundreds and hundreds of things that affect relationships. That are elements of two people in their relationship. But in fact, it all kind of boils down to three things. Of all the variables that we've ever talked about, there are really only three things. There's two people and their enduring characteristics, enduring traits. In a relationship, there are two people that have qualities that they bring to the relationship. And we've talked about a lot of those qualities. Their personality, their attachment style, their family history, whether or not their parents divorced, how much education they have, whether they're poor, middle class, or wealthy. their personality. Oh, their own prior history of relationships. These are qualities, everything I just mentioned and plenty more, that don't change. You carry them with you from relationship to relationship. That's, we talk about baggage. Well, that's your baggage. Your religion, your ethnicity, whether you're short or tall, your physical appearance, that's you. That's part of you. You take it where you go. And you've got some, and your partner has some, and to think about how relationships succeed or fail, we're going to have to attend to that somehow. And we've tried to. Another broad theme in this course is that the two people have processes that go on. There's things that they do. There's communication between them. There's processing inside the head. So there's things people do. So we talk, to understand a relationship, we have to understand who they are, and we have to understand what they do. What they do cognitively, what they do verbally, what they do behaviorally. Aggressive behavior, communication behavior, problem-solving support, all of these processes. You have to understand those things. But what I'm suggesting is we may be able to group them together, just for simplicity's sake today. And then there's external circumstances. The thing that is often forgotten. But all this is going on not in a vacuum, but in a context, in an ecological niche. That for some people is very supportive, is very rich, and for some people is very demanding and very impoverished. Well, first of all, I propose that every single thing that has ever been studied with respect to predicting relationship outcomes is one of these things. Now, all the different enduring traits that have ever been studied, they probably have different effects, but there may be something to gain from thinking generally, how do all of them as a group affect relationships? And the same way, there's plenty of adaptive processes, but there may be something to be gained from saying, well, how do all of them as a group affect relationships? And the same with external circumstances. So, our goal, we said, well, these are the things. There ain't nothing else. And if these are the things, then how do we fit together? How do we fit together to create the machine of relationships? Well, let's build it. Let's put the pieces together. We haven't so far, but let's do it today. And the first question we said is, what is the engine of change? In this machine, this theoretical machine that we're going to build, what's the engine of change? Well, think about it. We've talked in this course about where does change come from most directly. Change, ultimately, we said, everything that affects relationships must do so by affecting the interactions between the partners. That's where people touch. I mean, touch conceptually. I can think about you. I can be neurotic or needy or secure. But ultimately, the only way I can affect you is by interacting with you somehow. So I'm living my life, and you're living your life, and the chains of our lives connect only when we interact directly. Now, in a relationship, people interact a lot. But all the things in my life can affect you only by affecting where we touch. In other words, the interactions. I didn't invent this point. It was Harold Kelly who made this point. That's a point that we made early in the course. But it means that this is the engine of change. Adaptive processes are what directly affects relationships, or relationship outcomes. If the adaptive processes are good and effective, then we're happy and we can stay happy. If the adaptive processes are maladaptive and ineffective, then we're not so happy and we might even get less happy over time. The engine at the middle is how these processes go. That's what's either adding another brick to the wall of our satisfaction or pulling a brick down from the wall of our satisfaction. So that's got to be in the center. But what we said in this course is that answer by itself is incomplete. Did I ever quote for you Rick Heyman? Rick Heyman is a clinical psychologist, a behavioral psychologist, and a really super smart and nice guy at SUNY Stony Brook. And he said this, in talking about behavioral models of marriage. He said, saying that a relationship, I must have quoted you this because I love this quote. Saying that a relationship failed because the couple couldn't communicate well is like saying that the patient died because his heart stopped. It's true, but it's also meaningless. It doesn't tell you what you want to know. The question isn't, oh yeah, the heart stopped. The question is, well, why did the heart stop? And for us, it's easy to say, yeah, well, bad behavior is going to be bad for a relationship. Blaming your partner, raising your voice, physical aggression, yep, that all sucks. But the question is, where does that stuff come from? Why do some couples adapt effectively and other couples don't? That's a crucial question. It's been a crucial question for all of us. Well, I mean, it's been a long course, 10 weeks, but ultimately, the way that we answer that crucial question is pretty straightforward. There are two reasons why people might adapt, might interact with each other more or less effectively. One is characteristics of the partners. Some people have enduring traits, or they bring baggage to the relationship that makes it hard to adapt effectively. Like insecure attachment styles, like parents who divorced, like a history of child abuse, like being a drug addict. All of these are traits that would interfere with effective interacting with the other partner. Some people bring characteristics that enhance your ability to adapt, like a lot of education, like a secure attachment style, like a low neuroticism score, like having been loved very well in your past by peers, parents, and partners. So that's one important answer to where this ability comes from. But it's not the only answer. The other answer is characteristics of the environment. Some environments make adaptive processes harder. Environments where you're distracted. Environments where where people are making demands on you. Environments where there are a lot of alternative attractive partners that would lower your commitment to the current partner. Characteristics of the environment affect this process. Characteristics of the environment can also support the process. Having family that support you. Having family that want you to succeed. Having friends. Being in a culture that says, devote yourself to your relationship, it's important. All of that affects this process. So if we can actually think about now putting these pieces together and drawing a picture that would help us to answer this question. And what would that picture look like? Well, first of all, this picture has a name, and the name of it is the Stress Vulnerability Adaptation Model. And this is a model that Tom Bradford and I put together and published in 1995. And it's been a very successful paper for us. A lot of people have cited it and thought about it. We don't talk about it in the textbook that much. You know why? Because we didn't want to draw too much attention to our own work in the textbook. Just seems not right, you know. But I'm going to draw attention to it in the course. That seems okay. So we call it the Stress Vulnerability Adaptation Model because it puts together three things. Stress, i.e. environmental characteristics. Vulnerability, i.e. characteristics of the individual. And adaptation, i.e. adaptation. So let's start. What goes in the middle of it? This is one of my rare animated slides. I animated it myself. Let's see if it works. Okay. So here's the engine in the middle. Here's the engine in the middle. Adaptive processes directly affect change in satisfaction. Positive adaptive processes make happy changes, which then feed back to make it more likely you're going to adapt effectively. A happy, positive cycle. And a negative cycle, too. Maladaptive adaptive processes means negative changes. Now you're a little bit less happy. A little less happy people do a little bit worse. A negative spiral. You don't like that. But that is, what we're basically saying in the model is, change in satisfaction directly comes from nowhere but this. It can't come from anywhere directly but that. And of course, change in satisfaction is one predictor of whether you stay together or break up. When satisfaction declines, people are more likely to break up. Satisfaction that goes up or stays high, people are more likely to stay together. Now we know from social exchange theory that that's not the only predictor. There's also, look at that. Barriers and alternatives get in the way here. So this is a direct predictor of staying together or breaking up, but there's also, if you can't leave, if there are barriers, if there's no alternatives, well then even change in satisfaction won't lead to this. So this gets in the way. And that's from social exchange theory. In this course, we talk about this a lot, but conceptually, theoretically, this is the puzzle. This stuff's not so puzzling. Unhappy people are going to break up unless they can't. Makes sense. Happy people are going to stay together unless there's a really attractive alternative that's even better. That's not a mystery in my mind. The mystery is you're happy, you want to stay happy, where does it go wrong? Well, the answer is you're happy, but then the process is not very satisfying. And then the question is, well, where does that come from? And we came up with some answers. It comes from enduring characteristics, it comes from external stresses. You notice there's 2 arrows here, and only 1 arrow here. It's because we're saying adaptive processes can change the way your stresses work. Stress comes out of nowhere and affects your adaptive processes. You can't control it, but you can affect it. If you adapt effectively, maybe it lowers your stress. If you adapt poorly, maybe it raises your stress. Some people have said, well, why don't you have an arrow here too? If you adapt poorly, it can make you insecure. If you adapt poorly, it can make you, a depressed person, where you weren't before. That's true, and you can put an arrow there if you want it. But I think that there's a much stronger effect in this direction. Because we really want to say, this is who you are. It's not changed. The parts of you that cannot be changed have a big effect on this. And then we've also added that. So we're starting at the beginning. You have initial satisfaction. You are happy. Congratulations. You're feeling what people want to feel. You're feeling what Romeo and Juliet felt. You're feeling what life is about in many respects. That feeling. The feeling that, I'm not alone in the universe. I have a connection. There's someone who, A, loves me, and B, I love. There's someone who is part of my team, is on my team, and they chose me. They don't have to be nice to me because they're related to me. No, they chose me and I chose them. We chose each other. Miracle. You're feeling that. Good for you. That's a great thing to feel. That's why we're here. What's going to happen? Well, this is going to be immediately affected by your enduring characteristics. Some people can hold on to this feeling more than others. They're just by disposition. Some people are going to have more demands on them than others because of their environment. But generally, all 3 of these things are going to affect how you adapt at the beginning of a relationship. And remember, we had newlyweds in our lab. They're all pretty happy, but they don't all adapt effectively. Their happiness, all narrow, adaptive processes, wide range. And the machine is off. Let me give you an example of how this played itself out. There's some interesting implications of this model that aren't immediately obvious. And basically, the implications look like this. The effects of any pair of these bubbles on each other will themselves be shaped by the other bubble. What do I mean by that? Here's what I mean by that. Think of an enduring characteristic like depression. On average, I've told you a number of times, depressed people have weaker, less adaptive processes, or less adaptive processes. Depressed people have more trouble resolving conflict, more trouble providing social support. But let me ask you this. Of all the depressed people who get into a relationship, who's going to have the best chance? And who's going to have the worst chance? Of all, once you've got a bunch of people who are depressed, well, the answer to that is down here. Of all the people who are depressed, the people who have the worst chance are the people who also have a lot of stress, because they have a lot to adapt to. On the other hand, of all the people who are depressed, the ones who have the best chance are the people who have the most supportive environment. If you're depressed, you're not doomed, but you're in much better shape if you also have strong family that support you, resources, good education, decent job, access to counseling and therapy. The kind of stress that you have moderates the effective enduring characteristics on adaptive processes. That's not totally obvious, but there's a lot of research that shows that it's true. In the same way, stress, on average, bad for adaptive processes. But when General Motors closes an auto plant, putting 8,000 people out of work, as they're about to do, and there'll be a lot more than 8,000 people that lose their jobs. That's a stressor. A lot of them are married. Which ones will do the worst? Which ones have the best chance of surviving in terms of their relationships? Look up here. The model says, when a stressor hits a community of families, the families that do the best are going to be the ones that have the most enduring strength, the most personal strength. And the ones who are going to be the worst off when the same exact stress hits are the people who are already depressed, the people who already have problems with alcohol abuse, the people who already have had problems in their childhood, parental divorce, childhood traumas. Those people will suffer the most given the same external stress. Now we're getting somewhere. Now we're getting somewhere. Because we're trying to understand, okay, a relationship. It starts off happy. How does it succeed or fail? Well, let's have an example. Okay, let's give an example. Let me tell you a story, and we'll use the model to explain the steps of the story. Okay, here's the story. Let's imagine we've got two people, a man, Mario, and a woman, Julia. Mario and Julia. Okay? Mario, what do we know about Mario? His parents stayed together, but were quite domineering. He grew up with a bit of a sort of a rebellious streak that many women found very attractive when he was a teenager. He doesn't like to be told what to do. He's very independent. He's a little bit impulsive. His personality is that he's quite an impulsive guy. He wears a leather jacket. He rides a motorcycle. And he meets Julia, whose parents divorced, and specifically her father left her mother when she was a young kid. So she was raised by a single mom who had a series of boyfriends, and they were never around. And so she was always looking for sort of a strong male figure in her life. That's something she just happened to always be lacking. They meet, and it's love. She thinks he's the coolest, most awesomely masculine guy ever, and he thinks that she's pretty and sweet and they take care of each other beautifully, and there's all sorts of romance, and he drives up under her window and climbs up the trellis and gives her roses and all the things you'd want young people in love to do. And they're very, very happy. And they actually meet in high school. They're both actually still living in their parents' homes. Not a lot of stresses on them in high school. They're being supported by their families, and they're working at the mall. Doesn't matter. Not a lot of external stress. So, how are their adaptive processes at this stage of the relationship? Well, they're pretty good. They don't have that much to adapt to. They don't have that many big decisions to make. And when they fight, they do fight like cats and dogs. But the makeups are great. So what happens? What happens to this young couple? Well, it's high school graduation time, and they decide that they should get married. Why should they go to school when they're in love? Why don't just get their lives started? They don't feel like they need a higher education, so they do get married. And they're still very, very happy, and they have a very cute reception, and all people come, they're very, very happy. And they find a little apartment together, and they're extremely happy. And then what happens? Well, now, their environment has changed, hasn't it? Before, they didn't have to make a lot of decisions about, paying bills, because they were living at home, their parents were paying bills. Now they're paying the bills together. And Mario is having trouble keeping out a job because, that rebellious independent streak, that turns out to be not that effective in the job market. And, and Julia really wanted a big masculine guy to take care of her, but Mario isn't actually doing that much caregiving now that they're in a relationship together. So she still wants what she wanted before. She hasn't changed. But their situation has changed. And suddenly she finds herself sort of asking him more for things that she thought he was going to provide, but that he isn't providing. The problem is that Mario reacts very poorly to being told what to do. He has an independent streak. And now she's saying, could you do this for me? Why aren't you doing this? I'm a little disappointed that you aren't taking more care, more responsibility for our home. And that's the problem, because that's exactly what he doesn't like. And they start to have more fights. The makeups are still great, but they have more to fight about, because they have more decisions to make together. Because now they're sharing an apartment, they're sharing responsibilities, there are bills to pay, there are a kitchen to clean, and no one's doing it for them. So the ratio of positive romantic times to difficult, complicated times is changing. But they're still pretty happy. And then, here's what happens. Julia gets pregnant. They're married. They wanted to have a kid. So they decided, we're going to put it in God's hands. We'll sort of be a little bit relaxed about birth control. And sure enough, before they've been married more than a year, she gets pregnant. And now their satisfaction goes way up, because that's a very exciting thing. And they're very excited. Their families are very supportive. Lots of people are excited for them. They get all sorts of onesies. By the way, you can have too many onesies. Like there's other gifts you can receive for baby onesies. It's very nice, but enough. Okay, that's the point. The point is that they're very excited, because that's an exciting thing to be pregnant. And also the world just supports you when you're pregnant. Like, everyone wants to touch the belly, and it's wonderful. And then the baby comes out. And it's a pretty healthy baby, beautiful baby, but like a lot of babies, it cries. It cries a lot, they don't know why, and it cries all night long. And now they have more to do. Now their environment is full of a stressful thing, which is a baby that's making a lot of demands. And Mario says, part of me is that I don't love people making demands on me. But Julia says, part of me is I need to be taken care of. That's my whole point in life. And this becomes a problem, because now she's saying, I need you to take care of me, and I need you to take care of this baby now. It's not just about me. And Mario says, and he doesn't actually come out and say it, but he starts feeling less and less comfortable with all the demands being made on him. And it makes him more and more sullen in the house. And their adaptive processes, they have less time. They have less time to do the kind of romantic things they used to be doing a lot of. They have less time for sex, less time for dates, because there's a baby, they can't leave the baby at home. They have family that supports them, does babysitting once in a while, and that's a good thing. But those families also have their own issues to deal with, and so a lot of times they're left alone with the baby, and that just takes more and more time away from the intimate stuff that they used to do. 6 months after the baby is born, they haven't had a positive moment in a while, and they've had a lot of negative ones. And their satisfaction isn't what it once was. 6 months after that, Mario is spending a lot of time away from the house, because all of these processes push exactly his buttons. He finds himself reacting rebelliously the way he always has in his life. And she's finding herself feeling abandoned the way she always has in her life. And she makes him even more demands to try to get something out of him that she lacks, and he withdraws even more. And all of this is changing their satisfaction, bit by bit by bit. Do they stay together or do they break up? Depends on the barriers and alternatives. Depends on whether Mario, when he's away from the house, meets someone that he thinks he can do better with. Depends on whether the disapproval of the family is a barrier that they can or cannot cross. But this is a relationship that if you ask them sometime later, they say, it's not what we wanted it to be. And then I ask you, or a policymaker asks you, or a researcher asks you, why did this relationship go bad? Why is this relationship not the relationship they wanted it to be? And think of the simple answers we'll reject 10 weeks into this course. Is it because they didn't know enough? Is it because these were broken people that couldn't have good relationships? No, that's not it at all. They might well have had a good relationship if different things had happened, if they had a more supportive environment, if they had been wealthier, if they had decided to, if they'd had more education, better jobs. They might well have had different kinds of, their enduring characteristics weren't a death sentence to the relationship. Well, maybe it was that they just didn't know how. Could we have taught them to do better? Taught them better skills? Well, we might have taught them something. But the fact of the matter is, that the power of our ability to teach them is probably not as great as the power of external stressors and their own enduring characteristics on their adaptive processes. If we just handed them money, would that have solved the problem? It wouldn't have hurt it. It couldn't have hurt, but they still would have had these sort of broader issues of wanting things from each other that the other could not give. Why did this relationship go bad? Why do a lot of relationships go bad? It's the whole system. It's the whole system that works together. And that's how relationships succeed or fail. This is the answer. So, a couple concluding comments. There are 3 more minutes. If that's how relationships work, that's a broad overview. But if that's our answer to how relationships work, it's a system, all those things work together, and that's how they work together. Well, relationships, certainly marriage, have changed a lot over the last several decades, right? Divorce rates have really risen over the last 50 years. What's changed? If that's how relationships work, is relationships working differently now than they have in the past? Well, I think a lot has changed, a lot has remained the same. And not just over the last 50 years, but over the last 1,000 years. Humans need intimacy. That was not an invention of 1968. That's always been true. It's part of the human condition. It was part of being primates, and it's part of being Homo sapiens. We need intimacy. And intimacy is defined the same way all over the world. It's someone who loves you, it's someone who you enjoy being with, it's someone who takes care of you, it's someone who you want to take care of and make sacrifices for. That hasn't changed. So what has changed? What has changed in the last century is the context of intimacy, the rules in which intimacy can be expressed. And the change is this: the rules have gotten looser. It once was that the roles we play, the ways we can express intimacy, were pretty narrowly prescribed. They were pretty narrowly prescribed, and they were prescribed by people outside ourselves. Society said, wives, this is what you're going to do. This is all the things you can do. Husbands, this is all you can do. Nowadays, men and women, in their relationships with other men or other women, have to make these choices for themselves. As the rules have gotten looser, as our standards and our roles have gotten looser, it puts more responsibility in our hands to define for ourselves how intimacy will be expressed, how roles in a relationship will be negotiated. Well, that's a challenge. And it's a challenge that makes relationships maybe harder. But it also has the potential to make them better. And that's a potential that we need to seize for ourselves and for the people around us. And that